All right, let's go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for being here tonight. It's a great crowd. My name is Mike Draney. I'm a biology professor here at UW Green Bay, and I'm a member of the Advisory Council of the Harvey Kaye State of Democracy Speaker Series. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about the series and to introduce our speaker soon, but first I'd like to introduce you to the Dean of the College of Health, Education, and Social Work, Dr. Susan Gallagher-Lepak, to welcome everyone tonight.
Hello, everybody. Great, looks like a great crowd. I'd like to start by reading UW Green Bay's land acknowledgement. We at the University of Wisconsin-Green Bay acknowledge the First Nations people who are the original inhabitants of the region. The Ho-Chunk Nation and Menominee Nation are the original first peoples of Wisconsin, and both nations have ancient historical and spiritual connections to the land that our institution now resides on. Today, Wisconsin is home to 12 First Nation communities, including the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin, Forest County Potawatomi, Ojibwe Nation communities, Stockbridge Munsee Community Band of Mohegan Indians, and the Brothertown Indian Nation. We acknowledge the First Nations people of Wisconsin. Well, again, good evening. On behalf of UW Green Bay and the College of Health, Education, and Social Welfare, I'd like to welcome you to the Harvey Kaye Speaker Series. As Mike said, I'm Susan, Dean of the College of Health, Education, and Social Welfare, and I'm pleased to have the college co-sponsor this event and for us to gather here to learn about wellness and Indigenous food knowledge and practices. I want to tell you just a little bit about the College of Health, Education, and Social Welfare, which has undergraduate and graduate degree programs and certificates in areas that are important to our communities, such as nursing, social work, teacher preparation, community health education, and other health studies majors. I'm especially proud of our EDD in First Nations education, currently the single doctoral program at UW Green Bay, and hopefully we'll have another soon. This program is the only graduate level offering in First Nations, Indigenous, or American Indian studies in the whole UW system, the whole University of Wisconsin system. Not only is it unique in our UW system, but also within our state and region. By design, this EDD program involves Indigenous teaching methods, Indigenous assessment methods, and brings in Indigenous oral scholars who work collectively, collaboratively with our First Nations faculty. In the College of Health, Education, and Social Welfare, we aim to inspire students and transform communities through our amazing programs, students, graduates, and community partners. I'm a nurse and a psychologist by background and believe in health and health knowledge to guide us in being the healthiest selves we can be, including, and importantly, the food we eat. So I'm really excited to have our speaker here today. And without further ado, to introduce the speaker, I'll turn it back to Professor Mike Draney.
Okay, well, the Kaye series was created this past year to honor the legacy of Professor Emeritus Harvey Kaye, an intellectual giant who published nationally prominent books on everything from British Marxism to Franklin D. Roosevelt and the New Deal. Harvey ran the Historical Perspectives speaker series here for 30 years. Along with his wife, Lorna Kaye, they hosted well over 100 speakers over the years, speakers who ranged the political spectrum from radical E.P. Thompson to conservative Richard Brookhiser. To honor Kaye's legacy, we are thrilled to welcome you to the second and final lecture of our inaugural year, and it is my special honor to introduce our speaker, Dr. Rebecca Webster. Dr. Webster is currently an assistant professor and director of graduate studies at the University of Minnesota Duluth, where she primarily teaches courses in the undergraduate and master's programs in tribal administration and governance. She is an enrolled member of the Oneida Nation in Wisconsin and currently serves on the Oneida Land Commission. Prior to joining UM Duluth, she served the Oneida Nation for 13 years as an attorney for the nation's administration. She earned her BA in 2000 and her MPA and JD in 2003, all from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and her PhD in Public Policy and Administration in 2014 from Walden University. Tonight's talk is co-sponsored by New Leaf Foods Incorporated, which supports the well-being of the people of Greater Green Bay by promoting healthy food access and education to build a thriving local food system. One of their projects is the Brown County Seed Library, to which Dr. Webster has graciously donated a special Three Sisters mix of white maize, pole bean, and pumpkin seeds from her Oneida farm. I'll let Dr. Webster tell you a little bit about her deep relationship with the land and indigenous foods, but I do want to let you know about some of her books. She has a book related to tonight's topic called Our Precious Corn, and she has just published a very locally relevant book entitled In Defense of Sovereignty, Protecting the Oneida Nation's Inherent Right to Self-Determination, which is available at Turtle Island Books in town here or from the University of Wisconsin Press. So anyway, after her talk, we will have question and answers, and I'll have a microphone so I can move the microphone to wherever you are so that the people online can hear. We also, if people online want to chat, we can get the questions out here if there's time. And so without further ado, help me to welcome Dr. Becky Webster.
Sagole swagwake, Ganyata Gelu Niungets and Guehuene, Becky Webster Niungets out Slunige, Wagwaho Niwagit to load, Onio te Aga, Niwagahuanjot, Dulunkawane, Nitwagenu. So, what I just said in English is greetings, my friends. My name is Ganyata Gale, which means snow scattered here and there, trying to protect the land. My English name is Becky Webster. I'm Wolf Clan, I'm Oneida, and I grew up near Duck Creek that runs through the Oneida Reservation right here down the road. So today, this talk is entitled Food Sovereignty for Indigenous People. And I don't mean it to be totally misleading, but I'll probably only say the phrase food sovereignty once in the presentation. And that's because it has lots of different meanings to lots of different people. And I'm gonna spend the next 40 minutes or so explaining, without using those words, what food sovereignty means to me as an individual. So most of the presentation is going to start out with segments of a book that I had written called Yungwanasti. It's Our Precious Corn. And this was a real adventure to write this book. What I had done is I had gathered interviews from over 50 of our community members to ask them about their relationship with our corn, our heirloom indigenous corn. And I looked at the historical record and got historical information from our ancestors, from the early explorers, from the military folks, and I looked at what our relationship with this corn looked like, beginning with creation. And what I had found is an unbroken relationship with that corn through all of our colonization, assimilation, and removal. Throughout all of our darkest times in our history, corn had remained by our side. And today is a time that we're able to really celebrate our corn and that the eldest sister, the leader of the three sisters. And I want to take you on that journey. So we start with creation. And part of the creation story talks about there being a hole in the sky. And Sky Woman, who is pregnant with child, falls through this hole. And on her way down, she's grasping for, purchase to try to make sure she doesn't fall, but nonetheless she falls. And in her hands are roots from this tree that had been, that she was digging a hole near. And as she's falling and falling and falling, birds come and catch her. So if any of you are familiar with the Oneida creation story, you'll know that it's quite complex and quite deep. But what I had found in this research is how corn had a presence throughout all of it, even the time before Sky Woman fell to the earth. There was corn that was talking about stories of cooking it, of baking it, corn falling from the sky. All of this stuff is happening. So as she's pregnant and time goes on, she ends up having muskrat will come from dives down into the water to get some dirt for her as she's landing on Turtle's back. And he is the one that brings up this dirt so that she combines this dirt with the roots that she has grabbed, and then she makes Turtle Island. And time passes on, she delivers a girl, time passes on, and she in turn delivers 2 sons. One is born the normal way, the other comes out her side and ends up killing her. And then they end up burying her, and she becomes Mother Earth. So that sacrifice of her is what activates all of these plants that we know as the corn, beans, squash, the potatoes, the strawberries come out of her heart, and tobacco comes from her mind. So all of these things are born, and that's just one example from the story about where life is coming from this earth, and all of these things are coming to us. We next want to look at the Ganahela. So what that is, it's giving thanks. And we start a lot of our meetings that way, we start our ceremonies that way, by recognizing all of creation is intertwined. And people are just one of those little circles around this area. And all of creation is connected to each other. So every time something happens to one thing in creation, you affect all of the other pieces of creation as well. And what this talks about is talking about our responsibilities to be good stewards, not only of the earth, but of ourselves, and knowing that everything that we do has an impact on those around us. And so I'm going to start with my very first story that has been told by the late Brian Dockstader about the corn husk doll. So this woman was so beautiful, Brian begins his story. She had a gift to take care of all the children, and they loved her. The old people called her to the longhouse, and they told her it was obvious that she had this gift with children. So they told her it was her responsibility to watch over the children during the day. So while the women were in the fields and the men were away in the woods, one day she took the children to the pond to go swimming. And for the first time in her life, she actually looked in the water and saw her reflection. She never knew how beautiful she was because she never saw herself. She couldn't believe that she was so beautiful. So she ended up staring at herself all day long. When the parents came back to the end of the day, the kids were hungry and tired. So they went to the old people and they complained about her. The old people called her to the longhouse and reminded her of her gift and reminded her of her responsibility to care for the children. So she agreed to fulfill her responsibility. The next morning, the yearning to see her own beauty was so powerful that that's all she could think about. She took all the children to the pond, and again, she stared at herself all day long because she couldn't believe how beautiful she was. At the end of the day, a little girl was so tired that she was almost going to go to sleep in the water, and then the parents and the adults came back just in time to save this little girl. They were all so angry because this woman was clearly not fulfilling her responsibilities. So they went to the old people a second time to complain about her again. The old people called her to the longhouse, and they said this is the third time that they told her what her responsibility to the children was, and the second time they had to warn her to fulfill that responsibility. She again agreed to fulfill that responsibility. The next morning, the yearning to see her own beauty was so powerful that that's all she could think about again. She took all the children to the pond again. Like the day before, she didn't take good care of them and forgot to feed them. This time, a little boy was swimming and became so tired from not eating that he never woke up again. The adults were furious at the woman, and they were hurt. They went to tell the old people what had happened and how the little boy had died in the water. The old people told her. They reminded her 3 times of her responsibilities, and then it would now be up to Sungwayadisu, our creator, what would happen to her. The next morning, all the children went to find the woman. She was nowhere to be found. but they did find a corn husk doll in her longhouse. So this story really is talking about our responsibilities, and no one person is better than anybody else, and we all have a role to play in our communities if we want to make sure that everything works the way it should. So storytelling is a huge part of our history and our culture, and it's a way for us to gather. Another place that this happens is at husking bees. So Arthur Parker was a Seneca anthropologist from the early 1900s, and he has some really amazing stories that he had talked about husking bees and just corn in general, and I'm going to share one story from him. Remember this, he's coming from the early 1900s when he was talking about this husking bee. He says, "Work was play in those days when mutual hopefulness made money unnecessary. It was not uncommon for men to engage in this work. They were lured to the scene by the promise of soup, song, and society of wise old matrons and shy maidens. The old women carefully noted the industry of their younger assistants, and scheming parents were able to obtain information about prospective mates for their children. The older men did some work, but not much. They altered their wisdom by making wise observations, but soon lost their reserve in narrating exciting stories of personal adventures by relating folk tales. They knew full well that a pail full of soup awaited them when the husking ceased, whether they worked or not. Often the bee would be enlivened by a marching dance, and for this emergency, the men brought their water drums and horn rattles and cleared their throats for singing. The bees were often conducted out of doors under the white moonlight. A roaring fire of sumac brush or logs tempered the crisp air of the night, but left it sufficiently invigorating to keep up the spirit and keep the workers active. There was nothing unhealthful in these night carnivals where the smell of the corn plant, the breath of the pine trees blown by the autumn wind, the smoke of the fragrant burning wood, and the pure merriment of the workers, and the knowledge of good work furnished was the sole exhilaration." So I don't know about you, but I think that sounds like a really fun time. So what we have been doing is, we'll get to this later, is we have a co-op of our families who got together, and we have husking bees, and our harvest usually lasts the whole month of October. And sometimes when we get carried away and plant a little more, it extends out into November some. But here's just a snapshot of the gathering around the corn and us sharing stories, sharing food. There's usually, about 6 to 10 kids running around in the background, and that's healing for us. Not only is this food going to be something that we're going to be able to eat and share with our friends, but the act itself of going to harvest and sit around and husk is healing in itself. So next, I'm going to tell you another story that we have, and that is talking about the formation of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. So this story it's still pre-contact. So it's talking about how we have, and this is the Hiawatha Belt, and it represents this story of the coming together of the people. So from east to west, it's the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and the Seneca people. So it was another dark time in our history when there was a lot of warfare, people going from village to village, doing terrible things to each other. And Sunguaidizu, the creator, had sent down the peacemaker to deliver his message of the peace of mind, peace, power, and love. And he wanted to have this peacemaker spread this message to the people and unite them. And that's exactly what he did. But one of the things that was my favorite part of the story of how this confederacy came together is when the peacemaker was just still a young boy, and he went back to his mother's village, and he was sharing his message out to the chief about what he had come to talk about, what Sunguaidizu had told him that he needed to share with the people. And the leader of that village said, "All right, let's tell everybody." And he said, "Wait a minute. First, before we go getting into this stuff, I want you to gather all of the people of the village, from the youngest to the oldest. I want the men to go hunt. I want the women to go harvest some food, and I want the women to cook the food. Then I want us to sit down, and I want us to have a meal together. And then all of the merriment and joy that he had heard in the fields and in the kitchens and at the tables was bringing that community back together and then preparing them to hear the words about this peace, power, and love. So that is ingrained, that sets a protocol for sharing out what these ideals are under the Great Law of Peace. So then under that is what brought the Confederacy together. So next is contact. So the journals of the early explorers really talked about how they were amazed that these native people could have such vast and amazing fields and all of the things that were growing in here. And they just waxed poetic about it in all of their journals. And it really didn't take that long for the military people to follow behind them and realize that that would be a spot that they would want to attack. So it was right after that that they came and started burning the villages, just attacking the food source, knowing that that would be a way to really get at the people is by taking away what they had lived on. Throughout this whole process, my husband and I, we homeschooled our daughters. He took the lead on most of their homeschool lessons, but I got to teach them about Oneida history. And this is one of the things we had talked about. We had talked about contact, and we had looked at the journals of those early explorers, and I had my girls read them. And we looked at the journals of the military officials and how they talked about the Native people. And I have a quote here from my daughter, my oldest daughter, who was 15 years old at the time. "We were perfectly fine before the explorers came. We all helped each other grow and hunt for food. We helped each other survive. The Haudenosaunee was one big family. When the explorers first came, they seemed friendly because they spoke positively about our ways and our crops. We fed them and opened our homes to them. They were impressed with how much food we grew. They admired our agricultural ways, but it seemed they were just scheming on how to take it from us. When I learned about this part of our history, I was really upset. I wish there was something I could do, but there was nothing I could do. There was probably nothing they could do either. There were just too many colonists coming into our territory." So hearing it, I have known about our history for quite some time, and processing it and going over that, it feels like you need to process that trauma on a regular basis, and then you feel like you're finally getting over it. But then when you hear young people talk about that, and this is new to them, so they have to process all of this information too. So while we looked at the negative, we also had to look at the positive, but unfortunately it wouldn't come for a bit yet. So the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, we had existed before European contact and had agreed to, had this complicated decision-making process, and it had fully functioned. The one time that I'm aware of that it didn't function is during the Revolutionary War. And that is when the Oneidas and the Tuscaroras, who had joined in the early 1700s, had decided to side with the colonists, and everyone else in the Confederacy decided to side with the British. So during that time, there was a lot of strife within the Confederacy because we couldn't come to an agreement. We wanted to stay neutral. That was the primary goal, but it was quickly showing that we were not going to be able to remain neutral. So we had an Oneida chief had this belt made. It's called the Oneida Tribal Belt, and this is at the museum in Chicago. We actually got to visit with this belt, and it was just a crazy experience to know that this is the same belt that was brought out during the Revolutionary War to try to hold our Confederacy together. It didn't work. The Onondaga had to cover the council fire, they're the central fire, to cover that until the war was over. So as this war went on, we had George Washington, who had directed General John Sullivan to destroy Haudenosaunee towns. And there were a few Oneida people who had joined that campaign because we had sided with the colonists, right? And there's still a lot of hurt feelings within the Confederacy about what I'm telling you now. But it's important to note the role that those Oneida people played when they were accompanying Sullivan on his campaign to destroy these towns. So I'm going to read from you a passage that I had in this book because it has some important numbers, and just I want you to hear about how that all shook out. The journals detailed accounts of the devastation. In addition to the thousands of fruit trees uprooted and cut down, Sullivan and his men destroyed an unknown amount of beans, squash, and other vegetables, as well as an astounding 9.6 million pounds of corn. They destroyed hundreds of homes in over 40 Haudenosaunee towns. The destruction was so commonplace in the journals, the men eventually began to make casual reference to the quantities of corn and the number of homes they burned at each successive location. At each location, they ate their fill, packed a bit to supplement their rations, fed their animals, and destroyed the rest. When they came upon towns, they commonly noted that the residents had fled in a hurry because they often left behind food cooking over a fire. Fleeing or even a temporary truce seemed to be preferable over the loss of life that would ensue if the residents chose to stay and fight. Flight was possible because of the few Oneidas that accompanied Sullivan and ran ahead to warn the people that the troops were on the way. So even though we were clearly on opposite sides of this war, we still found a way to protect our Haudenosaunee relatives. But after the war, the Onondaga relit the council fire and the Confederacy was again reunited. But because there was so much destruction and so much turmoil that was going on in the Confederacy, it was again a still really dark time for the people. So Skanyet de Leo, you might know him as Handsome Lake, was a Seneca, a chief who had fallen ill due to alcoholism. And while he was out as a result of his illness, he was visited by 4 messengers and other things had happened to him, and he's now known as a prophet. And he brought to us the Gayawio, which is the good message. And this is talking about a way to reunite the people, bring back our ceremonies, bring back our Gunahela to be thankful for everything around us. One of the things that he had talked about is a situation where he was in the cornfield and he kind of thought he wanted to he thought he was going to die, and he was just ready. He was saying, "Fine, I'm just going to go, and I'll be done with it all," because he didn't want to be here anymore. And as he was walking through a cornfield, he felt the brush of a woman's arm around him, and he had turned and looked, and it wasn't. It was corn that was wrapping around him, and it was the spirit of the corn. And she had told him that, "I want to go with you." And he said, "You want to what?" She says, "When you leave, I want to go with you." And we all want to go with you because we're clearly not being appreciated here. Things aren't what they used to be, and people aren't taking care of us the way they should be, so we want to come with you. And at that moment, he had realized, wait a minute, if I go, then the corn goes, the beans go, the squash goes, everything goes. So at that point, he had recognized, no, I need to stay, and what I will do is I will try to get us to become thankful for you again. Even though he did do a lot to reunify the Confederacy, to revitalize our culture and our ceremonies, it wasn't enough. So shortly after this is when the Oneida people were removed to what would later become the state of Wisconsin. And this was, I didn't find out until a few years ago that this removal was supposed to include the entirety of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. But for all kinds of reasons, the Oneida people were the only one to come. The Stockbridge and the Muncie also, and Brotherton also came with us in our removal to Wisconsin. And what led to this, all kinds of factors. There were scrupulous land deals, all of those illegal treaties with the state of New York that left us nearly landless. Alcoholism was a big factor. So our ancestors had thought that the only way that we could really survive and get a clean start would be to find someplace else and establish a new homeland there. So this is what the quote I wanted to share you from my youngest daughter, Mia. She was 13 years old at the time. She said, "We shouldn't have had to move in the first place. The colonizers brought over diseases and alcohol. Our bodies were not ready for that. The colonizers made illegal treaties knowing they were not fair. They took all the land that we used to grow and harvest our food on. They put us through a lot of danger moving us west to a land we were not familiar with. We had to start new, which wasn't easy. They underestimated us. We were able to rebuild and establish a lifestyle in our new land. We were able to grow enough food again for all of us. But one thing I want to know more about is what kinds of seeds they brought with them. I know they were corn, beans, and squash, but what varieties? And what varieties did we have to leave behind? So this is talking about, my daughter was 13 years old at this time, and you tell them things and you think that they're absorbing, but then when you hear them repeat things back to you, you're just amazed at what they're actually absorbing and how they're processing this. So we were able to find, after this interview, more and more of our indigenous seeds, and I'll be talking about that at the end. But some of them were actually from her family, which was, it was really neat to see that come through, to be able to be reunited with seeds that we didn't know were still circulating in our community, that were viable and that we would be able to plant again. So we were doing great. We made a new homeland here. All kinds of evidence talks about us landing and clearing land, starting our agriculture, and things are back in the swing again. And things are good for a time, but not long enough. Because then came another assimilationist era, which is talking about the boarding schools and allotment. So I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with boarding schools. This is where they took our children and wanted to, the honest model out there, the motto was kill the Indian and save the man. So it was purposely to try to sever all of our cultural ties, to punish our children for speaking their language, to make them wear different clothing, to take away their ceremonies and to replace that with white Christianity. And the idea was that by doing this, that they were doing a service. So I wanted to read a quote from you from the church and what they thought they were doing at this time. The church's work among these Indians is the double one of helping them in their advancing civilization and educating them into greater self-reliance and self-support. It also seeks to prepare them to exercise intelligently their full rights of approaching citizenship and to develop that spiritual and moral Christian character that elevates work into duty and pours the blessed sunshine into every department of life. So they really thought they were doing us a favor, which looking back on it it's really disgusting to know what these children had to go through. And then not only that, but at the same time that this was happening, Congress also moved forward something called the allotment policy. So if you're not familiar with that, in a nutshell, in 1887, Congress passed the General Allotment Act. And what this did is it broke up communal landholding. So tribes had previously held land together as a community, and that's just how it worked. Well, they wanted to divide up those parcels, and this top map up here is a quick allotment map of the Oneida Reservation, where each individual tribal member received title to a piece of land. It was supposed to be protected for a period of time, but even that wasn't fast enough, and they sped that process up. So after that period of time, then the land would become taxable, you could sell it, you could mortgage it. Within a single generation of this happening on the Oneida Reservation, we lost 90% of our land, 90%. So where previously we were doing really fine, we were rebuilding ourselves in this community, they were taking our children away and they took our land away. So it was really difficult to try to maintain anything of what was going on in our communities, maintain our culture, our language, anything, when they were purposefully taking that away from us and trying to replace it with something that was completely foreign to us. So Mohawk Elder Tom Porter talks about this and its effects on our community even today. But the Indian people were not born to be failures. We were survivors. We were people of dignity and honor. We were not born to be the most likely to be alcoholic people in the world. That is a new development in the last 150 years, this negativeness among my people. There are reasons for this, and one of those reasons is because our great-grandfather and grandfathers and grandmothers were forced to go to this government school. which stripped them of their language, their beliefs, their culture, and their spirituality. And so it is without identity and without dignity that the Indian is walking the earth, almost in a state of numbness, and almost without a goal, without the feeling of being wanted by anyone, even within our own society. Because our whole society has been broken. That is why we have the highest rate of alcoholism, why the highest rate of drug activities is among the Indian nations, and why there is such hopelessness. So when people say, why don't you just get over it? That is why we can't just get over it. So there's going to be a whole lot more healing that our communities need to do to be able to get over these things. And one of the things that we're hoping for is that our agriculture, our corn, our beans, and our squash are going to lead the way. Our ceremonies are going to lead the way. Our language is going to lead the way. Our spirituality is going to lead us the way back to becoming whole again. So after the Allotment Act, Congress wanted to find out, hey, so how did that work? Because the goal was to break up tribal land holdings and assimilate Indian people into mainstream society. That was their goals. Well, the Merriam report came out and said, yeah, you did. You broke up those tribal land holdings, and now non-Indians own most of the land that used to belong to the tribes. But you did not assimilate Indian people into mainstream society. What ended up happening is Indians were more poor and desolate than ever, and they remained on their reservations. So the way to overcome that would be to restore management of tribal affairs to tribal governments. And that was the Indian Reorganization Act. So people talk about the Indian Reorganization Act as part of the New Deal project. And it did offer a lot of good things for tribal communities. And in Oneida, sometimes you might have heard that the Oneida people, we voted for it. So we said, yes, let's accept the IRA and let's organize under this new model that the federal government is telling us to organize under. But what often doesn't get talked about is that it wasn't a landslide like people think it is. It wasn't a unanimous thing going on in our community. There was a vote, but not everyone went to the polls. So there was Works Progress Administration that came after the Indian Reorganization Act as part of the New Deal program. And this gathered stories from Oneida people, from other Oneida people in the late 30s and early 40s. And one of them, his name was Andrew Beechtree, and he talked extensively about this. So there were two factions in Oneida, the New Dealers and the Injun Party. And this was the traditionalists. They did not want to have the Indian Reorganization Act, but there was a lot of violence going on in our community at that time. And here's what Andrew had to say about that. Our advice to our still loyal backers was to stay away from the polls if they didn't believe in the act. We figured the New Deal party would win anyway, so why waste time and risk getting crowned unceremoniously? At about the time of counting the ballots, I screwed up my courage to go and hear the results of the election. I hired a white man to drive me down there because I thought if anything happened, I could have him as a witness. I also did not care to create a young war. So there was all kinds of incidents with the police, brawls that were going on, a lot of fighting before this allotment, or before the Indian Reorganization Act passed in Oneida. And but one of the good things that came out of that is that Works Progress Administration part of the whole New Deal. So because of that, we now have all kinds of stories. We have a wealth of information about what was going on in Oneida between, the late 1930s and the early 1940s. And they talked about everything in there. They talked about religion. They talked about recipes that were in there. They talked about the removal to Wisconsin. They talked about alcoholism. Everything that you could think about is captured in those stories. So now that's a wealth of information to go back and talk about with them. And another thing that was really prevalent in those stories is corn, beans, and squash. So even during all of that time, our corn is right there by our side, with stories about how the old timers would want to encourage people to try to eat more of our traditional food and not want to eat our modern foods. So it's kind of funny to look back and say that they were saying the same thing, and here we are, we're in the same boat, where we know we should be eating more of our traditional foods, and we're not. So maybe one of these days we will heed those lessons. After this came a period of time in the late 40s to early 70s. It was really difficult because there wasn't a whole lot in the written record. But when I was able to go to our community, that filled in this gap. And I learned all kinds of things about those people who still held on to our corn and grew that for the community and had fun things like corn soup sales, Gunnastohal, which is our cornbread, and we're able to make that available for our community. So Gunnastohal is our cornbread, and the way that's made is you take our corn, you hull it in hardwood ashes, and then you wash it. Okay, and then you wash it, and then you lay it out to dry, and then you grind that up. So there's all kinds of stories about cooking that corn and going up to house and on these sales to be able to sell this corn. So, all right, I'm going to go ahead and get into what happened after that. So we had Iroquois Farms in '78, and they are the ones that, in Oneida, it was meant to be like a co-op, and that was a revitalization for our community. Quickly following that was Junhinqua, Oneida Cannery, and Oneida Retail, which grew corn for our community. And how much time do I have left?
Well, it's 7:40 or so.
Okay.
We're trying to let people go by 8.
All right. So we'll just speed through these then. Also within our community, we have the Oneida white corn growers. Remember at the beginning I showed you that picture of us husking? So that's us here, our co-op. We have about 10 families, and we grow our white corn together. We also have Ungwakwa. So this is our family farm here, and we have a Facebook account, Twitter, we're on Instagram, and YouTube. And so we talked about is wanting to create a safe space for these seeds to come home and wanting to create a safe space for people to learn about all of the things I was just talking about. And so just to give you an idea, 2015 is the first year that we started to grow our corn, and that was our braid, and we were so very proud of that braid. And this was our harvest from 2021. So even though we're still new at this, we have a whole lot more to learn, and we learn a whole lot every year. So this was our property when we bought it, those squiggly lines. There were over 2,000 tires on our property, and we had a lot to clean up. Here's some things. We were able to get some USDA grants to get a high tunnel, some more grants for tree planting and a pollinator habitat. So we've been doing a lot of improvements in earth healing to our property. Our pond, we had dug a pond in there because it was a really wet area of our property. We used that to fill in some of the building for the house. And we have lots of toads and frogs singing in that area, and it's really becoming more of a natural habitat. We built a certified commercial kitchen on there, where we offer classes to the community about how to prepare our foods and how to care for our foods. And we built a pavilion last summer so that we can host more events for the community to learn. And we just recently built a trading post. No money is accepted in here, but if you want, you can come here and trade things. We have our corn, our beans, we have tea, we have venison in there, we have squash, we have all kinds of things in there for the community to remove money from the equation and recognize that we all have different things to offer other than money. And that's just an aerial shot of our property. I think we're getting ready for an event there. You can see our gardens out there on the pond. And so in general, here's some pictures of some of the events that we have hosted at our property, all kinds of fun. So summertime is when we do most of that. And the general, here's some of the seeds that we were talking about, this rematriation. Rematriation just means seeds coming home to us. So these are some of our partners in that. Here's some of the varieties that have been returned to us, not only from like Seed Savers Exchange, but of other indigenous growers from other nations recognizing our seeds and bringing them home and giving them to us. What the future holds for us, we are now in 2 different programs. One is to wild plum tree growing with College of Menominee, and Seed Savers Exchange, we're about to go down there and graft some historical varieties of apple trees. Even though apples aren't indigenous to us, we have a long history, like I talked about in the Sullivan campaign. So all of this, what does this all mean? Is that every time an indigenous person plants a seed, that is an act of resistance, an assertion of sovereignty, and a reclamation of our identity. And that is my definition of food sovereignty. Thank you.
Well, we've got some time for questions now, or comments, whatever you'd like. I'll start down here. So, yeah, please use the microphone so that the people online can hear. And then we might have some comments from the people online. If you want to type into the chat, we'll see if we can answer that too.
Hi, Becky. My name is Dwight Hill. I just wanted to tell you that my grandfather went to Carlisle, and my grandpa Earl was one of the first speakers. His reading and writing English was non-existent. Them two would be in tears with what you've presented today, and I'm very, very honored to be a part of this. This is amazing, and what you're doing for the people and the knowledge you're telling everybody is something they would have dreamed of and only thought of in their dreams, and it's coming true. I just wanted to tell you, Yaunko.
Yaunko.
Go ahead, Becky, if you have a response.
I won't be able to without crying.
That makes me feel very hopeful. That's the only comment that I want to say. It makes me feel hopeful today.
I asked my mom what my great-grandma, who was a boarding school survivor, would have thought. She said she would have been scared first, but then she would have been proud.
Anyone else? Would you like to say something? It's okay to cry.
My question's very simple kind of thing. So this is really impressive. I'm very pleased to learn of it. Can I just ask, is this an independent initiative by a set of families, or does the tribe itself have a role in a formal political way in this?
So yeah, the tribe has the Junhinqua, the cannery, and retail. So those are all tribal departments that do this. There was actually a shortage of corn for a couple years that the tribe wasn't growing enough, and people would get really upset. And we thought, well, wait a minute, that's our responsibility as community to be growing this food and sharing it with each other. So that's when we formed the cooperative. And we had also been growing corn in our backyard, and it really just took hold. And that's when we also decided to form Unguaqua, which is our family farmstead. We were able to form a 501c3 nonprofit to be able to offer more things and to be able to access grants to share that with our community members. So we not only have the tribe, we have a co-op of families, and we have our nonprofit. So it's all of these different ways to try to address the things that are going on with agriculture in our community.
And I just have a follow-up question to that. So the corn seed that's for any of these plants, in fact, is there a depository or repository on the reservation?
Not really. And one of my favorite seed mentors, Jessica Greendeer, she's Ho-Chunk, she had told me that the most dangerous place for a seed is on the shelf. So we want to keep our seeds in rotation. We want to keep them growing. We want to make sure that they stay alive. And we have seeds at home, but we try to keep them in rotation. We try to make sure that they do stay alive. Other people have cold storage and different ways to preserve some of their seeds, but we think the best way for us is to just keep growing them every year.
Anyone else?
You mentioned Seed Savers Exchange. Is this the one in Decorah, Iowa?
Yes.
Those are my cousins.
Oh,
actually.
yay.
So when you were having your, when you were talking about it, that's all I could think of before you even mentioned them. I was like, oh, I wonder how you preserve the seeds and how you're able to exchange them, and if you had reached out to them.
Yeah, and Seed Savers is great because they had kept a lot of our varieties alive when we didn't ourselves, because they were growing them,
Yes.
and then they were able to return some of them to us.
Yes, like the dill seed, actually, that is my great-great-grandmothers. So my family is very interested in it, obviously. Do you sell any of your seed varieties through them?
No, we don't sell any of our seeds at all. We make them available to trade with our community members and our trusted allies.
That was my next question, if you had them for trade.
Yeah.
So, thank you.
Yep.
Hi, I grew up in Texas, and a lot of the healing that I experienced culturally with my friends' families was through food. Specifically, my friend's grandmother gave me her cornbread recipe, which is probably a very, very different kind of cornbread, but it's a kind of empowerment and an interesting way to look at cultural healing through food. And it's really, really a powerful story, even for somebody who, you know, isn't from this area. It's really, really cool to see, you know, this kind of action.
Thank you. And it's a safe way to come back. And what we have to recognize is that it's okay to not know these things because we didn't get them passed down to us. And what a way to learn about these is by gathering and sharing our foods. It's a very, you know, protected way to do that. Hi.
So you know, Sarah and we're both teachers, and I am wondering about your efforts to connect with kids in your community. And as a teacher, I see like what our kids get for lunch, and it's all wrapped in plastic, and it's all quick, and it makes me so sad. And like trying to think of ways of getting kids. I mean, we have our farm camps in the summer, and to see how excited kids get to grow food and handle food, and they don't always trust it, and it's like fresh and green. And I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit maybe about any efforts to connect youth with the food and the gardening and things that you're doing.
Yeah, so we have some of the youth come over for tours and events at our farmstead in the summer. But one of the things that we also do is when we have classes, they're usually multi-generational, and it just happens that way. So we have the kids, we have their parents, and we have their grandparents. And we'll do things like we'll show them how we traditionally, roasted and pounded our corn using our traditional tools and implements. And we'll also show them more conventional ways to do that. So they get to see these foods, and when they can process them themselves, I think that it just hits a little different, and they take ownership of that more, and then they start to want it more. And some of the parents have come back, and yes, so-and-so, they really love the mush. How do we get more mush? How do we do this? How do we incorporate it into their diets? So that's always a good feeling when the kids crave that.
Becky, I'm wondering if you've done any research on connecting the enclosure movement and the model of land. So many of my ancestors were Polish, and they were peasants in Poland, and they embraced and continued the enclosure movement in the American continent. And we seem like one of our things that have caused a lot of problems in agriculture is this ownership of land and the consolidation of land, and you talked about it with the apportionment. And the model that the native peoples, the indigenous peoples have is such a great model, and it seems like a parallel and a natural solution to so many of our problems. Would you reflect on that?
I'm not sure what the enclosure movement is, but one of the things that Oneida has done is, remember I told you that we had lost 90% of our land in a single generation. One of the good things that the Indian Reorganization Act has done is to allow us to buy back land. So we have been doing so. So we currently the Oneida Nation owns about 42% of the land on the reservation, which is amazing considering what it was at one time. One of my critiques, though, is how are we using that? I think we have grown so fast that we just keep doing what we've done before, and we're trying to find more ways to get that land access to our tribal members for, their co-ops. Maybe they want to do a berry co-op. Maybe they want to plant maple trees. Maybe they want to do other things, and it's just not currently that accessible. So I would almost like it to be like it was before, where more of our tribal members had access to be able to use, but we're now creating our own red tape to make it difficult, and I'm hoping that we can overcome that soon.
You had mentioned something right at the beginning about ancestral seeds. I was just wondering if you could talk more about that.
Yeah, so the seeds that we grow on our farmstead have been handed down from generation to generation since, as we would say, since creation. So these are seeds that we have, and we actually were just reunited with some seeds that have been continuously growing in our community that our ancestors had brought with them from New York. So seeds that have been growing here for over 200 years are now being stewarded at our farmstead.
Hi, I wanted to go back to the land discussion. In one of my First Nation Studies classes, we've been talking a lot about the kind of what's happening up in láku Flambeau right now with the closure of those 4 roads. Do you think the tribe is being like kind of exercising a little out of their rights because they're isolating? I think it's over 60 households right now, and I don't know what they are when the easement talks were going on, but now they're asking for 20 million. Do you think they're, I don't know, because you seem very knowledgeable about tribal land and all that, so I wanted to get your opinion.
Yeah, I only know a little bit about that, but it just feels like all of this history I laid out before you, nobody really wants to take responsibility for that. We've had some seriously dark times in our history, and everyone's like, oops, sorry, oops, sorry. But yet, all of a sudden, when some of their title companies screw up and they realize that if this is indigenous land, oh, sorry, can we, no, stop. We need to really look at what we're doing, because if that was somebody else, if that was a Walmart, if that was some other company or some other business or a non-tribal member who owned that land, they wouldn't try to railroad it through the way that they do to indigenous land, and they do it time and time and time again. And the only way for us to do something is to take a stand.
Hi, I'm very new to this, and I'm very thankful that you are here to teach us about all of your culture and all the things that happen. And I just wanted to know what started like this for you? What started getting your word out there so people know like your history and why this is so important to you and your like culture?
I think it's just always been something I've wanted to learn about and I wanted to know more about. And even growing up in our community, we didn't always have access to it. And I wanted to make sure that as we found this, as food really just grabbed a hold and took us, as the seeds became a greater part of our life, and the methods of planting and the methods of cooking and the methods of making these tools, that we were able to search and find them, we wanted to make sure that it wasn't as difficult for people to find them behind us. So we wanted to gather all of this information up and share it. And our daughters, now this is just natural for them. They're 17 and 18 now. They've just grown up with this kind of stuff. They've grown up with our language, our culture, our songs. So this isn't something that they have to work so hard for. And I think that's what we're trying to do, is we're continuing to round up all of this information and put it out there in such a way where other people can have access to it and they don't have to work so hard.
Hi, thank you for being here. My question was just with it being kind of like the election cycle. I was just wondering what you were looking for from not only local politicians, but politicians in general in regards to like food sovereignty and land sovereignty.
I think a primary one is awareness. It feels like we're left out of the discussion quite a bit. We're overlooked, and our voices aren't really heard. So it's important for us not only to have our voices heard, but for our allies to speak for us when we can't be there, and then for our allies to make space for us so that we can be heard.
I think
we have time for one more question. Maybe Rebecca back here.
Thank you for this amazing talk. What can people in the audience here today who enjoy planting seeds do to contribute to this act of resistance?
I think, again, it's the awareness. Become good allies. Listen to our stories. Make space for us. We also have a 501c3 nonprofit, so you could donate to the nonprofit. It's tax deductible. I had to put that out there. But really, it's just creating those spaces to have conversations with people. And I know a lot of non-tribal members are afraid to talk to us about these things. But no, we have a lot of non-tribal allies that we really rely on and we count on to be, because we're all a part of this community. Nobody's going anywhere, and we need to figure out how to be here in this space and live together.
All right, that seems like a good place to wrap it up. It's about 8 o'clock, so thank you all once again, and let's thank our speaker. I'm sure that Dr. Webster will be willing to talk to you if you have some more questions afterwards, and yeah, drive safe. Thanks.